Hi everybody, I hope you're all able to hear me. This is Prakriti from McGraw-Hill. We welcome you all to the Stay Tuned webinar series. Hope you are all doing safe and sound. We are going to be talking today about the economics of the pandemic presented to you by Mr. Flynn. He's the author of international bestsellers on economics, an expert in behavioral economics. Sheen currently serves as the chairman of economics department at Scripps College in Claremont, California. Over to you, Sean.
Okay, wonderful. Well, let me begin by saying thank you to everyone who's joining us. I'm very honored to be able to speak to so many people so far across the world. And so hopefully I will not disappoint you and will have something interesting to say about teaching economics, even, which will be my focus to our students right now. There's a lot of uncertainty out there in the world and whatnot. And so I hope everyone can see the first page here of my slides. And so I'll just begin the, my little talk here. Me to make sure the questions take us. So thank you very much. And so let me begin with the first slide here, which is just sort of contents. And so, I put most of these as questions. So how do we provide students with historical context? That I think is very important. Did governments get the cost benefit analysis correct? Estimating the costs of the pandemic, as economists, we want to do cost benefit analysis for public policy. Then looking at government sort of justifications for intervention, right? Or basically come down to positive and negative externalities, and then arguments over multiple equilibria as justifications for lockdowns and, harsher forms of social distancing. And is how quickly will economies recover and employment. And so let me, before I go any further, preface everything I'm about to say with the fact that I decided for this presentation to stick with US data and data sources that I knew very well, and people sometimes whose research I knew personally and know that they're credible. So there is nothing here on any other country except tangentially, and so my apologies for that. I'm Japan. I was born and raised in the Philippines. I've lived all over the world, and I also married a Punjabi girl. So I'm a little sad that there won't be more of an international focus here, but I'm hopeful that anyone watching the presentation will be able to take some of the things that I'm saying here, which are sort of general universal economic things, and apply them wherever they happen to be teaching. So on to the next slide. My students here in the United States didn't have a lot of historical context, right? I'm a history buff and almost got a PhD in history before I became an economist. And, I'm very well aware of the fact that until very recently, maybe say after 1950, when vaccines became widely available throughout the world, plagues and epidemics were just completely routine. And then they'd also double up with famines and starvation, and all sorts of bad things would happen. But my students, at least, and this includes our international students, don't have any real memories of that. And so I think it's important for them to know that we should probably be evaluating this in a wider historical context. So what you're seeing on the screen here was an opinion piece published by Margaret Atwood, who's famous as the author of the novel The Handmaid's Tale. And she's Canadian. I think she's in her 80s now. And so she can remember growing up in the 1940s, as it says here on the screen, and just how normal it was that there was scarlet fever and diphtheria and malaria and everything else in Canada. And that, just showing, these kids aren't terrified. They're out in front of someone else's house who's got polio, and they're under quarantine, and they're playing, even though that was a fatal disease at the time. And so not that I think we should be flippant now or downplay the risks and the mortality or anything like that, but I think definitely our students need to understand that what we're experiencing right now is the historical normal, and what we experienced for about 50 to 70 years there was very abnormal in world history. Okay, so next slide. This is just a standard marginal cost, marginal benefit diagram. And the point I would just want to make here is that it's really hard to do public policy if you don't know where those lines are, right? If you don't know whether the marginal benefit line is way to the right or to the left, or the marginal cost line is very high or very low. And in this case, you know, I've got the amount of social distancing on the horizontal. And the way I'd like you to think about that is that starting at the origin at 0, that's no social distancing, and then you start with the mild things, and then you get to the much more restrictive things, and then at the extreme right there would be full lockdowns and keeping people at home. And I think the most extreme I heard about were in China back in January, where literally people could not leave their house except for one person in the household once a week could go get food, and they needed a government permission to do that. And so, you know, one thing we want to discuss here with our students, if we're going to take an economic perspective, is what is the optimal amount of social distancing? How far should the governor have gone? When do the costs become bigger than the benefits? But again, that's really hard to do if we don't know where these lines are. So, and I'm about to say things a little later in the presentation, evidence that I've found convincing that perhaps many governments went way too far. That we didn't, but on the other hand, that's with 20/20 hindsight, right? It's easy to criticize afterwards when you get more information. And so this slide, I'm just trying to list out things that governments were dealing with in February, right? Because it wasn't even until the last week in January that the World Health Organization publicly acknowledged that there could be human-to-human transmission, right? So in February, there was still a lot of doubts and confusion, right? And so we didn't know how lethal the SARS virus was, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Some initial estimates were as high as 3.6% mortality. The latest numbers in the United States for our mortality are 0.26%. So, you know, order of magnitude plus lower. Another question that was how transmissible is it? We didn't really know. And it was very confusing because some of the early data, like on the cruise ship, people locked up together for 2 or 3 weeks, and, you know, half of them never got the virus, even though everyone was in close contact. And so that, you know, no one knew how transmissible it was. And then, of course, to what degree should social distancing and lockdowns be imposed? And then also, how long should they last, right? This wasn't clear to anyone what was going on. And so, again, that goes back to this idea about it's hard to do public policy using cost-benefit analysis if you don't know the answers to even really basic questions like how lethal is this virus? Okay, so much has been learned in the last couple months, and we've now got Israeli research reports, Italian, French, and US reports looking at super spreader events, right? And it looks like super spreaders are, it's sort of like a power law Pareto distribution thing. Super spreader events may be responsible for 80% or more of the transmissions. And it's much, you know, not just do a lot of people show up to a rock concert, say, or a symphony. It seems to actually have to do with how much of their lung capacity they're using. And of course, this virus gets into the lungs, and that's how it harms people. And so the super spreader events are really disproportionately concentrated in places where people are using their breath and their lungs aloud. So multiple instances of choir practices all over the world where, you know, there was one practice and then half the people got sick. Intense exercise indoors in close quarters that involves breathing hard. That apparently is a risk factor. The Koreans identified that because they've been very good at tracing people back and contacts. But on the other hand, if you're at a gymnasium, even in close quarters, doing something where you're not breathing hard, typically like, say, yoga or, you know, some other form of stretching or something, there doesn't seem to be an increased incidence of the disease. And football matches, notoriously one in Italy that spread it all over Lombardy. If you've seen a European soccer match, people are yelling and screaming for hours, really using their lungs. Tightly packed bars, we have several instances of that. And here in the United States, there's a Mardi Gras celebration, the beginning of the Lent period for Catholics down in the state of Louisiana, which is traditionally very French Catholic. And that's a big drunken parade where everyone is shouting and really close together. And they got a huge incidence in New Orleans after that parade day of the disease. And so this, I think, is really useful information because it suggests that we should have probably targeted our efforts a little more, or we could have perhaps gotten a lot of the benefits of social distancing with only the milder things like banning large events, shutting down bars, and so on. Okay, so here's some data too that sort of, backs up this idea that we might have gone too far for the lockdowns. And so this is something JP Morgan's derivatives people published last week. And, this is publicly available data they're using. So on the horizontal axis is the daily infection rate during national lockdowns. And so each dot there is a different country on the graph. And the vertical is the rate after the lockdown ended, right? So, and if you believe that lockdowns suppress the spread, then it would be natural to have the implication that lifting the lockdown would increase the rate of infection, right? So if lockdowns were effective, you'd expect the vast majority of these dots for each country to be above that 45-degree line rather than below. And so this is very suggestive international data that the lockdowns as they were imposed, right, not the milder social distancing, but the full-on lockdowns may not have worked. And similarly, let me go to the next graph. This is within the United States. So all those little dots here are different states, like SD stands for South Dakota and WY for Wyoming. And, again, you've got the, in this case, the RO, that is the basic reproduction number in epidemiology, which is how many people are you going to infect on average if you have it, right? And for diseases like the measles, the RO is like 15, right? So each person who gets the measles on average infects 15 other people. For a lot of our big flus like SARS 10, 12 years ago, the number was about 2.5. And so, what you're looking at here is a graph for each of these states that asking, well, what was the RO at the end of the lockdown? And then what was it afterwards? And again, if you thought lockdowns would work very well at suppressing the disease, then you'd expect most of these dots to be above that 45-degree line rather than below. And so this is sort of, when, America, we play our version of football, there's this position called the quarterback, and we call this Monday morning quarterbacking because the games are played on Sunday, and then all the fans on Monday morning, they know better than what the coach was recommending and the plays that were run and everything like that. So I don't want to put too negative a spin on any government official who is in the very delicate position of trying to do cost-benefit analysis. But as we go forward, I think this new data should inform future epidemics and future responses. Okay. And I think so I basically said everything that's on this slide, right? Lockdowns may have been too extreme a form of social distancing, and we might have, like with a Pareto rule, an 80-20 rule, been able to get 80% of the benefits at 20% of the costs. But of course, we went to shutting down economies in a very dramatic way. And so for this, I'm going to use US data next. Actually, sorry, one more slide, and then we'll get to that. And so this would be the cost-benefit analysis of the optimal amount of social distancing. So equilibrium A is where the marginal benefit curve that we feared in February, right? Because more social distancing brings benefits. So if there's a lot of benefits from social distancing, that curve will be to the right. The one marginal benefits is feared in February. And then the actual looks like it's much further to the left, and so if you're explaining this to students, this would be a simple graphical way of showing them that the optimal amount of social distancing at point B is noticeably less than at point A, and therefore, at least in retrospect here, there's a case to be made that we went too far initially. But of course, we didn't know where the curves were initially either. And so I think that's a important caveat for our students to understand, that one of the problems public policy makers always have to deal with is ignorance. And not because they're stupid or uninformed. These are some of the smartest people you'll ever meet working in public health. But they, if you don't even know what the infection rate is, it's hard to recommend the optimal policy. Another way to think about this is if you think about production function and social distancing as an input, and the output being, cumulative benefits from social distancing, you could measure them in dollars of lives saved and stuff. If there's diminishing returns, and this curve is concave downward and sharply, has its slope getting flatter and flatter very rapidly as you move to the right, then it'll be the case that with just a relatively small amount of social distancing, and here these numbers on the horizontal are arbitrary, right? But here, 20% out of 100% of the social distancing efforts might have given us, the way I drew the graph, say 40, 50% of the benefits, right? And it could be that that curve is actually much more concaved and sharply bent than I drew it, in which case maybe 20% of the social distancing could bring 60 or 70 or 80% of the benefits. And so I think one of the interesting research areas going forward, as we get so much data from so many countries, is going to be, these cost benefit analyses about the marginals and how, what are the incremental costs and benefits for various particular government initiatives. So as I said before, I decided to concentrate in this talk on US data, just because I know that much better and I know some of the researchers personally and whatnot. And so here's the big figures, and some of these are from government data, some are estimates, but at least 40 million US workers out about 160 million in the labor force in January have become unemployed. So about 250,000 American workers were shut down in March and April and into May. Current estimates of GDP, as a flow, are down 30% year on year. So April's GDP in the United States this year versus a year ago was down 30%. And then if you want to accumulate them, the cumulative costs so far are about $1.3 trillion, or about, almost $11,000 per household in the United States. And 11,000 is a lot compared to the median household income of 64,000, right? And so that's just 2 months of economic carnage has taken away about 1/6 of the average family's income, right? And obviously the government's been supplementing this and been sending out stimulus checks. And so on a personal basis, these numbers aren't that horrific, but that's a lot of lost output there. Almost 11,000 per household so far. And of course, the number is still accumulating. So the best, easiest website for US data on the pandemic is this one. And they bought the website pandemiccost.com. The data in the website are run by Casey Mulligan at the University of Chicago, who, he's of a caliber that there's a slight chance he'll get the Nobel Prize someday, right? He's been the head of the US President's Council of Economic Advisors under Obama, and just a really top flight labor economist and data guy. And so he's been updating this website daily. And let me show you some of the great graphs that are there. And everything on the website is public domain, and you can just download it and give it to your students and things like that. So this is the cumulative cost data that he estimates for the US economy. Each bar is for a different day, starting on March 8th, I think, and going through earlier this week. And, the bars are, all other costs and then mortality costs. And he is using a sort of standard number. There's this value of a statistical life method used in the United States, for wrongful death lawsuits and stuff like that. And the number he's using is $4.3 million per life, which may be a little high because a lot of the people who've been dying are already in hospitals and probably had a 3-month life expectancy anyway. So you could argue that maybe the blue parts of these bars are a little too high, given the demographics of the people who unfortunately have been killed. But even the rest of it, the non-mortality costs are absolutely staggering, right? And they're going to be well into the multiple trillions by the time this is over in the United States. And just to put that in perspective, US GDP last year was about $21 trillion, right? So the fact we've already gone through $1.3 trillion of costs in a couple months, taking that away from the year's GDP is very significant. All right, this graph are the cumulative, these are the daily flows. So the columns here, if you went back to the previous graph, and I'll click back, are the ones that add up, because this graph here that you're looking at right now is cumulative. These are the daily flow costs, and you could see that they ramped up through about April 5th or April 10th, and then they were more or less flat after that, right? So one way to explain this to students would be that people working in restaurants all got shut down. People working at Disneyland got shut down. People working in sports leagues got shut down. And so most of the costs were being borne disproportionately by just a few people, whereas a lot of the economy kept on running, right? And so that's why these daily flow costs sort of topped out here at about $25 billion per day, rather than themselves continuing to increase, because we have not seen, after an initial massive surge in unemployment, a lot more additions to that, right? And hopefully now it'll start falling down because a lot of the United States is reopening again. Here is a graph, again, from Casey Mulligan of daily estimates of the number of Americans working. And so if you go to the left there, those are in millions. And so it was about 160 million, 158, 159. And so we're down now to about, I don't know, 110, a little less. So more than 40 million jobs, right, out of 160 million. So this is bad. This is very bad in terms of, foregone output and consumption. In addition to any, individual horrible costs about, being driven into poverty, which is happening to some people right now. And this is the daily estimate of aggregate work hours, right? Because you might be thinking from the previous graph, and let me click back to it, that the number of Americans working, well, it fell 40 million, but maybe some of these people had two jobs, right? Maybe they had two part-time jobs and they lost one of them, right? Or something like that. And so you might think that the aggregate work hours might not have been affected as badly, but this graph here shows that they were, right? The economy, this was all indexed to February 2020 on the vertical axis. So taking February 2020 as an index value of 100, even by March 8th, which is the first little tick there on the horizontal axis, we were already down maybe 2%, right? Because it's under 100, even on March 8th relative to the month of February. And then it's been a precipitous decline. And so aggregate work hours, as you can see there on the far right of the graph, are down more than 30%. And so that's, very, very, very bad going forward. 30% decline in GDP, puts the United States back 10, 15 years in terms of GDP per capita and stuff like that. So this next graph goes directly to GDP and the damage. And again, on the vertical axis, Professor Mulligan scaled this to 100 for February 2020. So, the flow of GDP in that month, and the government publishes data on this. We've got a handle on that. And then you could see a precipitous decline as the lockdowns began in mid-March. Like my college, for instance, we sent all the students home on March 15th and told them not to come back after spring break. We just do everything online, which is what we did. And then even after that initial precipitous decline, it's still been trickling downward through this week, right? And so GDP is almost down 30% in the United States relative to, its pace, its flow value in February. So that's also very bad. And so let me now just go back into public policy, since we've now got some estimates on the costs involved, right? And you've got to weigh the costs against the benefits. And so there are two basic justifications here that I could think of as an economist as to why government intervention was called for. And I'm going to show some graphs on these, but one of them is positive externalities, right? So if I wear a mask and if I'm feeling feverish, I stay home. I not only, does the mask protect me, for instance, it protects other people from me, right? Because I'm much more less likely, hopefully, to be a disease vector for other people. But of course, as economists, we typically think of people being motivated by their private benefits and ignoring the spillover costs and whatnot. And so one argument for the government intervening here was that people would not spontaneously engage in enough social distancing. And looking back, though, it's nice. Before our government started acting here in the United States, both the federal government under President Trump and the state governments, right? Each state in the United States has an elected governor. It was already the case that, for instance, our National Basketball League had shut down. The sports leagues had shut down. A lot of restaurants and businesses had shut down completely voluntarily before the government gave any orders. And so you could view that as them deciding that, when they ran their own cost-benefit analysis, just looking at their own costs and benefits, they were willing to shut down. But you could then make the argument that, well, if there are a lot of positive externalities that aren't being taken into account by the private calculations, then the government will need to impose even harsher or more extensive lockdowns. So that's one economic reason for justifying the lockdowns. And the other is sort of a multiple equilibrium argument. And I almost used the term pooling equilibrium here, but then I remembered something vaguely from my grad student training and went online and double checked, and a pooling equilibrium only exists in a signaling game, so I can't use that terminology. But you can imagine that there are multiple equilibrium possible here, like, for instance, high disease and mortality, low disease and mortality, and that government intervention could push you from one equilibrium to another. And the push might only have to be temporary, and then the government could, sort of relax once it gets you to the good equilibrium. So let me go into those in a little more detail here in a way that, if you think that those are interesting concepts, you could, explain them to students, right? So I spend a lot of my time teaching the first year university students at my college who come in without any economic thinking. And, we have to teach them how to think like an economist. And so this, from a marginal benefit, marginal costs graph, this sort of analysis would be the argument for high levels of social distancing, right? And it depends on the extent of positive externalities here. So I've drawn here two marginal benefit curves. One, the lighter colored private one on the left, and then the darker colored one on the right. So that's labeled marginal benefit social. And here, I mean, the social includes both the private benefits and the spillover positive externalities to other people. So it's encompassing the curve on the left, and then you could think of the horizontal shift there as being the additional benefits from social distancing, or if they're undertaken. And so, no, excuse me, I said that wrong. The total benefits, total declining marginal benefits, if people were taking both the private and the externality benefits into consideration. And so that would lead you to equilibrium point A there, where there's a higher level of social distancing than at point B, which is what would happen if people only looked at their private benefits and weren't taking into account the positive spillover effects on other people if they were to, practice additional amounts of social benefits, right? And so this graph would be an argument for government intervention, right? And I already talked about a little this earlier, and I'm sure everyone on the call here is familiar with the concept. But this, I think, is the simplest way to explain it to students. And of course, you could go be more elaborate and do dead weight loss triangles and welfare analysis and stuff. But just in terms of, if you're dealing with a part of an economic class that's more political economy, the government has to make decisions on the basis of something, right? And so here, this also is nice because people, presumably individuals, businesses, sports leagues, probably had a very good sense of their own marginal private benefits, right? That left curve. What's unknown to policymakers is how far to the right the other curve is, the darker curve, the MB social curve, right? Was it a little bit to the right? Was it moderate to the right, like I drew it? Was it even further to the right? Because the further to the right it goes, reflecting greater positive externalities, the greater the case is for government intervention. So getting back to that point I was trying to make earlier about how much lack of information there was in February as governments started to deal with this, one way to conceptualize it for students was the information that was missing was the extent of the public externalities and how far to the right that marginal benefit social curve is relative to the private curve. Okay. So under the multiple equilibrium argument, right? And on this slide, and I think, students often need a metaphor or example from something unrelated to get an economic concept. So my favorite multiple equilibrium argument is driving on one side of the street or the other, right? You can't have people just pell-mell decide. I, of course, have experienced this in Manila and Kuala Lumpur and Mumbai. And so I'm sure some of you have also seen sort of situations. But if you look more deeply in those situations, you realize that the locals, the natives who drive there every day, there are unwritten rules about where to go and when, which streetlights you could ignore and which places you'll treat an intersection as though it's a traffic circle, right? The locals know all these things. But that gets to the point here of the simplest thing a government can do, though, is to just create a pooling equilibrium, call it. I mean, that's an abuse of terms, but you either choose everyone on the left or everyone on the right. Either one of those will give you many fewer accidents and better utility. And so, India and Japan, I believe, are on the left. I know Japan because I've driven there. I've never driven in India, but that's my memory. And on the right, most other countries, right? But either one works well, and government should. There's a really good case here that government should intervene to push society towards a clearly superior equilibrium here. And again, this is maybe the best case scenario for this multiple equilibrium argument, because governments can do this one time and everyone gets used to the new habits, and then the government doesn't have to keep imposing the rules, right? I mean, there's still police, cops, and stuff, but the costs of shifting from one equilibrium to another are borne almost entirely at the time the initial change is made. And so you might wonder if something similar might be relevant to this pandemic we're dealing with. And so you could think of there being social distancing as offering an infinite number of potential equilibria, depending on the extent to which people social distance. And it could be that some of the best equilibria involve high levels of social distancing that would not spontaneously occur without government intervention. So from that perspective, just like driving on the left or driving on the right, you could explain to students that, there's a big argument here that the government should intervene for higher levels of social distancing, unless they get information otherwise. And of course, that gets us back to the problem I alluded to at the beginning, whereas there's a lot of even now, uncertainty about the disease and its epidemiology and whatnot. And just here, I drew this thing. It looks like a prisoner's dilemma diagram. And, if there's two choices, mild distancing and strict distancing, and there's two people involved here, the way I did these payout numbers, right, and they're arbitrary, but the way I did them, like it's 100 and 100 for each person in the upper right cell there. In this case, it makes sense to social distance, right? If both people do strict distancing, you end up in that upper right cell where everyone gets 100. Whereas if anyone deviates from that cell, they're going to get lower outcomes, right? The problem here, and if you've got students who understand game theory, or at least the prisoner's dilemma, you could also point out that this could be a situation where the Nash equilibrium, the dominant strategy for each player, does not lead to the socially optimal outcome, right? And, that's actually the case in the prisoner's dilemma from the perspective of the prisoners, right? If they both kept their mouths shut and didn't squeal on the other guy, then they would both get light sentences and do very well. Whereas if each guy sort of goes on his own, which in this case would be everyone mild distancing, only taking their personal benefits into account and not the spillover effects, then you get to a bad equilibrium, which is the one I've got there in the bottom left corner where both people are losing 15 units, right? Negative 15. And so I think this might be also a useful way, although maybe not for a principles of economics class, the very first class, to explain to the students what's sort of going on, because they would need to sort of understand a little bit of game theory to have this presented to them, I think, successfully. Okay, so this again is United States data. And there's this great website that our Federal Reserve puts out called FRED, which stands for Federal Reserve Economic Data. and it allows you to plot graphs really quickly. And as it turns out, they don't just have US data. In some cases, they've got several thousand foreign data series. So it's very easy to use. You can pull data instantly. And what we've got here is the US unemployment rate over, decades and decades. And the last two recessions that were bad, sort of the 80-81 recession that I remember from my boyhood, my father was unemployed and things like that. And then the one after the financial crisis, what's being plotted on the vertical axis here is the number of Americans who apply each week for unemployment benefits, right? Because the way our system works here, your employer has to deduct, I think it's 1.25% of your income and put it into the local state unemployment insurance fund. And then if you lose your job through no fault of your own, you can go down and apply for money. And it's usually not that much money. In most states, it's a couple $100s a week. And to put that in perspective, the average cost of an apartment in Los Angeles now is probably at least $1,500, $2,000 a month. So getting a couple $100s a week is not, for the average person, going to really get them very far. But I bring that up because what the United States Congress has done in the last 3 months is make really generous unemployment benefits. But the reason they did that was the right-hand side of this graph is completely frightening. We'd never seen weekly unemployment claims even at 700,000 per week before. And then the week of March 28th, which was the first full week after severe lockdowns were imposed, 6.9 million people. So an order of magnitude greater, 10 times more than had ever been seen before, applied for unemployment benefits that week. And then an additional 5-6 million the next week, and then 5 million and 4 million. And so these are different people each week, right? So this is another way to see what the heck happens when 40 million of your people get put out of work, right? Unemployment, requests go through the roof. Okay, so next slide. So in the United States, both the Federal Reserve with monetary stimulus on the right, and then our Congress and the president with fiscal stimulus on the left, they were pretty darn quick to act, and actually noticeably quicker than 12 years ago during the financial crisis, where it took Congress weeks to pass a stimulus bill, right? Here it was done within 3 or 4 days. And so the biggest one on the left under fiscal stimulus in the United States, which was a law or bill called the Paycheck Protection Program. And what this does is give businesses, and it was, they attempted to target it to small businesses, but they basically told businesses that if you keep your workers employed, even if though there's nothing to do, that is, if you keep paying them during this crisis when they're at home in lockdown, we, the government, will lend you the money to do that. And we're going to make these forgivable loans. That is, you don't have to repay them. They're non-recourse in legal speak, meaning that if you default on them, the government can't do anything. So basically, they're stylized as loans, but in fact, they're grants. And so that was the major program there. And then there was also another one, the CARES Act. The second one there included a stipulation for really generous unemployment benefits, which I'll talk about in a second. On the right-hand side, the Federal Reserve, as you know, acted very quickly and in coordination with all the big central banks, Bank of India, Bank of Japan, to make sure that, international trade did not get shut down because there was a sudden shortage of US dollars in the world, which are used in, like oil markets are priced in dollars. Many goods and services are sold around the world in dollars, which means that if there's a sudden liquidity crisis in dollars, it affects countries even if they're not normally using the dollar for the 99% of their transactions, right? So it was good to see that the Fed, in conjunction with other central banks, acted so aggressively. But the interesting parts going forward for me are on the fiscal policy side. And so let me go to the next slide here. And the picture of this woman you're seeing on her screen, her name is Jamie Black Lewis. She runs 2 or 3 physical fitness and massage places. They're like day spas is what they call them. And up in, I think, the Seattle, Washington area. And so hers was the first media case I saw on something that has now become common. And when I say common, if I go talk to local business people, many of them tell the same story, which is that they can't get their workers to come back to work. And the reason for that is that the United States Congress, during the crisis with the CARES Act, topped off the normal unemployment benefits, which, as I told you, might be a couple $100s a week. They topped them off by an additional $600 per week, right? So then what this means, though, is that about 68% of hourly workers in the United States, the money they're getting now with these very generous unemployment benefits is higher than the money they would get if they went back to work. And so there are business people right now who are calling their employees and saying, come back to work. And the employees refuse to pick up the phone. And so that will probably be a problem through the end of July, because those generous $600 a week additional benefits will expire at the end of July. But of course, we're not even into June now, and we're attempting to reopen the economy. And if you can't get a lot of your workers to come back to work, well, then we are essentially delaying the recovery, or at least the beginning of the recovery, into August. And so this is a little embarrassing from a public policy perspective. And so now let's sort of look to the future here, right? And I'm almost done here with my talk and would love to take questions. But one of the things my students all want to know, and just, the way our academic calendar works here, most students, if they're graduating from university, will graduate typically in May in the United States, some a little later in June. The students who aren't graduating but finished another year, they typically go on to summer jobs and internships. But this whole thing happened in March, which was after many students had received job offers, but not all, the ones who were graduating, or internship offers for the summer. And then a lot of those started being rescinded, or companies said, we can't commit right now, we'll call you back in 2 or 3 months. And so my students have been deeply concerned about, their lives and their careers getting off to a good start. And so one way to look at this from a macro perspective is to look at unemployment and how it's varied over time, depending on business cycles. And so in this graph that you see in front of you, it basically starts after World War II, like 1946, 47, goes through the present. And the gray background bars there are all the recessions in the United States, right? The most recent one being the gray bar on the right at the year 2009. And so this is the unemployment rate plotted on the vertical axis here. And you can see that when we have a recession, unemployment goes up, which is what you'd naturally expect. But and then finally on the very right part of this graph, you see the current massive spike in unemployment. And it's next week, it'll be much worse. This was the first weekly spike. And in 1 week, it went from like 3.5% to almost 15%, right? And it's just going to keep going up, up, up. But there's reporting delays in the way the government collects the data and stuff. So we haven't seen the top of that spike on the right. But that top of that spike on the right is very frightening if you think about the downward slopes of all of those little points here, like in the mountain range. So think of the right sides, the downward sides, the declines after a recession in the unemployment rate. And if you highlight just those, you get a figure that looks like this. And why this is interesting is that Bob Hall at Stanford, and I'm forgetting her name, it's Maria Kudlak, she's at one of the Federal Reserve Banks of the United States, they just put out a really interesting working paper. And what they point out is that the rate at which the unemployment rate falls is very similar after every single recession, as you can see here by the slopes being very similar on all these curves, which are the downward parts of the unemployment after recessions. On average, the decline is about 0.55 percentage points a year, so about half a percentage point per year. But what's really interesting about this is that these recessions were all very different in terms of the government response. In some cases, the government flooded the economy with money. Other times, they actually induced the recession in 81 to drive down inflation. Sometimes fiscal policy was generous. Sometimes it wasn't. Differences in state laws, minimum wages. But that makes this particularly frightening for right now, because this shows a level of historical consistency that implies that policymakers can't really influence the rate at which employment usually recovers after a recession, at least in the United States. And I did not take the time to go look at British or Japanese or Indian unemployment data to see if it followed the same pattern of, identical slopes on the downside. But if this holds internationally, then it's of concern not just the United States, this pattern, but other countries. And it implies something horrible, right? Because we think our unemployment rate is going to hit about 30% at its maximum in the next few weeks before it starts falling. But if the recoveries in employment are typical, right, 0.5 percentage point per year, 0.55, then that would mean that it would take almost 50 years to get back to full employment, right? Because we were at 3.5% unemployment before this started. We think it's going to peak at 30%. And then if everything falls back at 0.55% per year, like after a normal recession, we're in really big trouble. But there's good news in this paper by Bob Hall at Stanford, which is that he and his co-author point out that probably the reason, and I'll go back one slide here, probably a reason the declines all have similar slopes is because it has to do with frictions in the job market. When someone gets permanently cut off from one job, typically the pattern that, macroeconomists have found and people who've studied labor markets, at least in the United States, is that it'll take them a couple years and 2 or 3 temporary jobs till they get a good replacement full-time job for the one they lost. And a lot of that is just simply the high frictions involved with matching workers with appropriate positions, right? And for businesses, this is, having an HR department and human resources to go interview people, and you have to put up advertisements online, and individuals have to come forward and pursue jobs on their end too. And so it could be that the reason employment and unemployment here in this case recover at such consistent rates is that the way job markets have been structured for the last 7 years hasn't really changed much, and the frictions are about the same, and the matching rate happens to be about 0.55% per year. That actually, though, is good news for our current situation, because we're not facing the situation that Bob Hall thinks is normal, where people lose a job permanently and then have to be matched with a new position, but instead, we have a position where our situation where all we have to do is get workers back to their previous job, right? And their previous employers know them, they know their capabilities, they know if there's, what we call firm-specific human capital, that this person has a lot of it and knows their particular business and their business procedures well. And so that is good news in this case, because we would expect, if Bob Hall's explanation of this is correct, that our recovery in unemployment in the United States this time should be much more steep and abrupt than previously, because we don't have to deal with this matching problem. And so I think that's my final slide for my presentation here, but I know we've got a little time left and I haven't answered any questions yet. And so I don't know if Prakriti, who's on the line here from McGraw-Hill, is going to select some of these questions for me. We sort of talked about that, or I could sort of pull them off little feed here.
Yeah.
Feed.
Hi, Sean. This is a great session, Sean. So we have a lot of interactive questions from everybody, actually. One of them, actually, a lot of them have questions particularly towards Indian lockdown. So I could, read one. This one: was India's decision to opt for lockdown as a tool of first resort to combat the pandemic appropriate? If you have any comments on this.
Well, so again, to use that expression in the United States, Monday morning quarterbacking is very dangerous, right? I think that any reasonable person will, if you could go back and see what governments were having to deal with in mid-March and the level of ignorance, and, the WHO didn't even declare it a pandemic until I think the end of February, right? And unless that happens, it's very difficult for, elected public officials, and you may know some politicians yourself, These people don't have, they're usually not medical doctors or anyone with specific knowledge here, or even statisticians or even engineers, right, with the math training to understand this stuff. And so I think that my opinion would be that what India did at the time, knowing what it did at the time, right, when Prime Minister Modi had to make a decision, was appropriate, or at least appropriate enough. It was a plausibly good response to the situation. Right now, other countries disagreed. Sweden, they never shut down their schools. They just shut down bars and large gatherings of more than 50 people. Right. So governments did vary. But I think the Indian response, which was very similar to the United States response, was appropriate at the time, given what we knew then. But knowing what we know now, I think that in retrospect, we would say that it looks like, at least the United States, I don't know what's going on in India in any detail, that we went too far. That's my personal opinion.
Great. Okay. We heard that. Now we have one more for you. So what are your thoughts on maybe flattening the curve without flattening the economy? Any inputs for developing economies that you would want to give?
So I actually did a 2-week sort of crash course in epidemiology models, and they're, very dubious. As you know, in physics, for instance, they still don't have really successful models of thermodynamic processes, which is why they still, for instance, put airplanes in the wind tunnels with the smoke, because that's the only way they can tell where the vortices and all the problems are going to happen with the airflow not being laminar and smooth over the surface. The computer models can't usually get it right. And you could think of this COVID pandemic or the world economy in general as a much more intricate, complex dynamic system than even air flowing over a wing on a model airplane. And so I think that the models were too simplistic in that they really are just sort of bathtub models, flows in and out of healthy people or infected people with exponential growth added in. Right. That's basically all they are. And it looks like now they massively, or a large fraction of researchers massively overestimated death tolls, infection rates, and so on, how quickly the peaks would go up. And so I don't want to sound like I'm evading the question here, but in terms of flattening the curve, I think there's a case to be made here that most of the actions, or at least the extreme actions governments took, didn't do anything to flatten the curve. It was the case that the way that the epidemiology of the disease worked all along, we didn't know it, but it's the case that the way it worked was we were never going to get a very high peak anyway, right? It was always going to be much lower. And so because of that, then you have less worry about these cost-benefit trade-offs, right? If the United States, like right now, the United States is about to pass 100,000 deaths. At the current rate of decline, cumulative deaths by the time this is over might be about 140, 150,000. And just to put that in perspective, if there's a bad flu season in the United States, right, because every year different viruses circulate through the world, and we typically have flu season in the United States. We think of it as winter into spring and summer. In a bad flu season, which will happen about every 10 years, we'll lose about 150,000 people. And so in retrospect, at least for the moment, what I've been seeing suggests that had we known with certainty back in February that this would look only like a really bad flu season, but a normal one, right? Every 10 years, there's just a bad flu season, but within the normal range of possibilities, then no government would have gone for the extreme lockdown methods. And so I think in terms of the future and future public policy, what government should pursue, if there's anything ever like this, hopefully there's not ever another virus coming out of a lab in China and the whole thing. But if this ever happens again, I think governments will tend to be, I hope they'll be much more cautious, because basically they assume that this was, the zombie apocalypse or the end of the world. This was the horrible disease that novelists like Michael Crichton have been writing about for 40 years, where, there's this one secret virus or something gets released from a Russian laboratory and, 80% of the world's population dies. Or it looks like the bubonic plague and it kills 1 person in 3, right? And so everyone sort of reacted to this by imagining, and this is my opinion, the worst case scenario that could be going on, and then doing the lockdowns. Whereas my guess now, looking at the data, is even if governments had done nothing, this would probably have peaked about where we've seen it in various countries.
Okay. Hello.
Oh, yes, I'm here. Sorry.
Are you able to hear me? And,
oh, yes.
Okay,
Loud and
so
clear.
let's move on quickly. Great. So I'll move on to the next question, Sean. We have this one very interesting question. Do you see any expected time of recovery for the Western and Asian countries?
So this is interesting. Opinions vary widely, at least in the United States, but I tend to go with, there's an economist at Harvard named Jason Furman, who also is a brilliant guy, also at a different time, the head of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. And he's a Democrat, a member of the Democrat Party in the United States. And he apparently horrified a lot of other Democrats last week by making the argument and presenting the data that the recovery in the United States was going to be very fast and very strong. And the reason this horrified his audience of Democrats is that President Trump is of the other party, the Republican Party of the United States, and they were hoping for a continuing recession through November, when our presidential election will be, such that that would diminish Trump's chances of getting reelected. And so Professor Furman got up and told them, yeah, don't count on that. Things may come back here very, very quickly. And so my personal gut instinct is to also bet on that. There will be certain segments of the economy that will be permanently, or at least for 3 to 5 years, depressed. For instance, hospitality, travel, giant amusement parks. I moved to Las Vegas a few months ago. The casino industry here, right, is usually lots of crowded, screaming people. Movie theaters, who knows when they're going to reopen again. So there will definitely be some permanent unemployment losses here, but my guess is that's going to be a really, really small fraction, right? When most of our states went to full lockdowns, we lost 1 job in 4, right? But that's not because people couldn't go to work. It was because they had to stay at home. We would not have seen 40 million people unemployed if, the lockdowns were voluntary or staying at home was voluntary. And so another way to say that is those people, I think, can go back to work very quickly, and there'll be jobs waiting for them and businesses happy to have their workers back and earning revenue. And so my instinct, at least for the United States, where I can, talk to business people and stuff, is that the recovery will, we're not going to get back to full employment in a year, but it could be that in 2 years, maybe 3, we don't even remember this happened really, that, it was just kind of a bad temporary memory and we're glad it's over, rather than the beginning of a Great Depression or something, which unfortunately, my students have come across those sorts of arguments online and gotten, I think, very much overly terrified about the future.
Okay. So, could have there been any alternative strategy to lockdown, Sean?
Alternative strategies to do what? Sorry.
Any alternative strategies to lockdown? So, a lot of governments opted for lockdown as the first strategy to, of course, beat this pandemic. So do you think there would have been any other alternative strategy to fight this pandemic?
Okay, so at least here in the United States, several of our states made a really bad decision when it came to older people, right? And COVID, it kills people who already have pre-existing conditions and health weaknesses, especially anything respiratory or cardiovascular. And so one thing we should have done, and only a couple states did this, was to basically quarantine off all of our old folk homes and our senior centers, right? Because a lot of older people live in these, especially as they get more frail. They can get sick enough that their family can't take care of them anymore. And we should have cordoned those off and not allowed visitors because largely maybe 40% of the deaths, I think the last number I saw in the United States, have been in old folks' homes. And that's especially frightening because the vast majority of old people aren't in old folks' homes, right? And so that 40% of the total number of deaths in old folks' homes is showing that something went really wrong specifically with old folks' homes in the United States, senior centers. And so one of the very dumb policy mistakes here, and Governor Cuomo of New York State is getting a lot of grief for it now, is that in early March, he was expecting such a tidal wave, a tsunami of hospitalizations, that they were expecting every hospital bed in New York City and every ventilator to be occupied. They had something like 8,000 ventilators. And so they were afraid that they needed to triage the people, and therefore they were going to have too many COVID victims to handle at hospitals, and therefore they needed to put them somewhere else. And so he ordered that nursing homes, senior homes, had to take people who had active infections into the nursing home. But of course, that's bringing them into an environment where there's a lot of other old people who are very susceptible, right? So that policy, and Governor Cuomo was trying to do his best at the time, given the information in front of him. But in retrospect, at least, that was a really dumb policy that probably got at least a couple thousand people killed. So if I had to go back right now and just sort of imagine what I would have done in retrospect, or what I would do if I had a time machine, I would ban all large public events of more than, say, 50 people. I would tell businesses, please don't do any non-essential travel. And I would ask people to do reasonable social distancing with their friends, like don't shake hands, wash your hands a lot, and so on, wear face masks even. But my instinct right now from what I've seen is that those milder methods of social distancing and isolation probably would have gotten us most of the benefits in terms of flattening the curve without all these horrible costs from unemployment and the economic damage.
Okay, Sean. Now we have one around unemployment. It says that there has been a huge amount of unemployment, especially in US as well, and there must be some steps that government, must have taken. And even if they are unemployed, is there something that the governments are doing to, help these people survive the crunch?
Well, various countries have taken various tactics, and they've also did it at various times. Like Japan only yesterday passed a massive stimulus bill that will, direct a lot of money at rescuing businesses and distributing cash to their citizens. And they have a tradition of this because during their deflationary period in the early 2000s, there were a couple times where the Japanese government just mailed people checks and said, please go spend money. We need more economic activity. So the Japanese just got to that. The United States, we started passing legislation, call it the third week in March and into the first week in April. I think governments have differed a lot here based on their sense of fiscal propriety, right? Angela Merkel in Germany was, very adamant early on that, wow, this could be a really big problem. A lot of people could die. But on the other hand, she refused to countenance any sort of massive deficit spending to pay for recovery efforts or this and that. And that was even more complicated because, if you're the European Union, do you allow Italy, for instance, to issue a bunch of debt to then pay for these welfare benefits? And essentially the Italians free riding on the German credit rating to be able to get a low interest rate to do that. And so I think governments have been dealing with some substantial political economy problems. But if a government were completely free, I think what it should lean to is if it can afford it. Obviously, that's another problem here. Nothing is free, right? So maybe I shouldn't have said a government's free if the government had a free hand. But to the extent that it was affordable, replacing people's wages at some reasonable rate, right? And as I told you, in the United States, our unemployment benefits were set too high. But at some reasonable rate so that people can, we have a very consumerist, debt-oriented society here in the United States, but people can pay their credit card bills, they can pay their rent, They could pay their home mortgage. They could, if they're running a small business, the government can lend them some money or maybe grant them some money to get them through the next 2 or 3 months. But to me, the real action there is once you've got the financial markets under control, which thankfully the central banks did collectively very well, in my opinion. You need a lot of fiscal policy after that. And just basically, and I'm not a fan of universal basic income or these other things, but this is an unusual situation. And arguably the governments did this to themselves, and so the government should clean up the mess and the damage, right? And make sure not many people's lives are destroyed. And just as one thing there, people who run suicide hotlines in the United States where, people could call in if they're feeling suicidal, the number of calls in some cities went up by a factor of 6 last month. And then we just got data today published that the number of prescriptions written by psychiatrists for depression and other things was up 86% last month over the year before, right? And so there's a lot of damage being done here to people feeling hopeless and isolated and just quite frankly terrified that they might die, that I think the government can do a lot here to get people to a sense of, if not comfort and safety, but to at least to a place where they do not feel in either immediate physical peril or immediate economic peril.
Okay, Sean. Okay, so before I let you go towards the thank you note, there is one request from a lot of professors from India that if you do research around, Indian data, that how lockdown has impacted the economy in India, and if you ever do any analysis, we would really, really want for you to share it with us so that, they can go through it as well. It will be really, really helpful for them to, go through your studies, go through your inputs, and maybe develop a mindset towards it that, what is the right thing to go with? What is the right kind of mindset to go about it with?
Certainly. And I would, I see a lot of people leaving email addresses here. So I will, yes, through McGraw-Hill, Prakriti, you, and then maybe more directly through some of these email addresses. Yes, because I was actually, and I wish I'd had more time to prepare for this seminar. I've been very busy this week, but yes, I would like to actually dig in deeply because India is such an important economy. And it's like the United States in that it's a federal system, the states and the governors, and they have a lot of power and stuff. And so I'd be very curious to see where things are similar and where they're different. And yes, I'm definitely up for that.
Great. Thanks, Sean. So I think we can, if you have any parting notes for us, for all the attendees that we have with us today, it's about time. So maybe we can hear that.
Okay, sure. So let me just say that, if anyone wants to get in touch with me, I forgot to put my email address here on the front slide. My first and last name, Sean Flynn, are very Irish and really common. In the United States, most cities have at least a dozen Sean Flynn. So you can't find me that way. But if you Google Sean Flynn and then Scripps College, SCRIPPS, that will get you to my email address. Alternatively, you could use my Japanese middle name. And the easy way to get that is you go online and you search for the book Economics for Dummies, one of those yellow and black dummies books, because I wrote that in addition to this McGraw-Hill textbook. And my Japanese middle name is there. It's Sean Masaki Flynn on the cover. And then you just Google that and you'll be able to find me very directly.
Great, Sean. Thanks for such an interactive session. I think we've all had a lot to learn from you. So we'll attendees. Thank you everybody for attending this session. It was a great interactive session. We had a lot of fun taking your questions. I think Sean also enjoyed the session very much. So we'll be in touch with all the attendees. We'll be sharing your certificate of participation very soon. The presentation and the recording of the session will also be available soon on our channels. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe, everybody. Good day. Bye.
Okay, good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.